In this video, we're going to cover 3 additional coil structures. A variation on the double coil that I covered in my last coils video, the King's coil, and the Alien coil. For our first coil, I've cut 2 6-inch segments of 22 gauge half round, one segment of about 4 inches of 16 gauge half round, and 2 feet of 30 gauge round. The first step is to take the 30 gauge and wrap it around one of our 22 gauge half rounds. Once I've wrapped it around a few times, I usually like to bend 90 degrees into the core wire to use as a lever to just twist a little bit more quickly. Once I've coiled the full length of the 2 feet of 30 gauge around the 22 gauge, I can begin to wrap it around the core. I've chosen to use half round, but you could use square or even round for this purpose. As I'm wrapping, I just want to be careful and make sure that the flat side of the half round stays facing inward towards the core. When I've finished the length of the coil, I can go ahead and snip off both endings and flatten them down. I like to make sure that they're flattened to the flat side of the half round. To make sure that the coil is uniform, I like to go back with my nylon tipped pliers and just flatten everything to the core wire. From here, I can finish the coil using our last piece of 22 gauge half round and twisting it in the cracks with the flat side facing out. I usually like to start towards the end of one side and slowly wrap it as tightly as possible into the cracks between the coiled sections. Once I've reached the end, I'm going to go ahead and secure the beginning side down, flattening it to the half round or the square, depending on what sort of core you used. And then I'm going to go ahead and run it through my nylon tipped pliers again, just slowly running it through, making sure that it is clamped down and even. Putting a little bit of pressure, but not too much on the wires. Once I've done that, I can go ahead, wrap my ending wire around one more time, snip it off and tuck the ending onto the flat side of the half round. This makes for a pretty cool variation of the double coil we talked about in previous videos. Using the flat side of the half round out Just varies the texture a little bit to your pieces. Let's go ahead and move on to the next coil. For this, I've selected 3 6-inch pieces of 26 gauge round, one piece about 4 inches of 18 gauge half round, and another 2 feet of 30 gauge round. To begin this coil, we need to make sure that all 3 pieces of 26 gauge round sit perfectly flush next to each other. I like to take pieces of masking tape and tape them all together in line every few inches or so, just to make sure that they're secured in their place as we begin to coil them together. I can go back with my nylon tips just to make sure that they are nice and flat together. Once I have them together, I can go ahead and put them into my clamp. To begin the coil, I'm going to take my 30 gauge and just very carefully wrap around all 3 about 5 times. I don't want to put too much tension on the 30 gauge or it'll cause our flat line of 26 gauges to compress together. I want to make sure that they stay parallel and flat inside this coil we're making. Once I have them coiled together, I'm going to go ahead and move them down in the clamp so it's clamping the 30 gauge on top of our 26s. And I can begin to rotate it like I would any other coil. Going slowly to make sure that that 30 gauge is lining up parallel next to itself and that we're not bunching our 26s. Just keeping them nice and flat. I like to add a little bit of pressure every time I reach the flat side of the 26s. Releasing that pressure when I go on the thin side just to make sure that they stay in line. Every few rotations I want to go back with my nylon tips just to flatten it out to make sure they're staying in line. I'm going to go ahead and do the same process to coil the rest of my 30 gauge round. As I reach the taped sections as I'm coiling, I can just pinch and pull them further down to give myself a little bit of extra room to coil. Before moving forward, make sure there's no residue from the tape stuck to the wire. Once you've coiled the full length of the 30 gauge around all 3 of the 26 gauge, we're ready to move on to the next step. Generally, just for good measure, I like to go ahead and clamp everything down one more time with my nylon tips, just to make sure it's nice and even. Then we can begin wrapping our coil around our 18 gauge half round. I like to keep the endings nice and neat, running parallel next to each other, and then snipping the endings and flattening them to the flat side of the half round. If you're using square, you can flatten them onto the square. If you're using round as your core, you may want to hold the ending, otherwise your coil will have a tendency to want to spin around as you're coiling. From here, I'm just going to very carefully wrap my coiled structure around the half round, making sure that it sits nice and flat and that my 26s continue to sit parallel on the inside of the coil. When I reach the end, I can go ahead and snip the endings again and clamp. I'm going to one more time go ahead with my nylon tips and just flatten everything to make sure it's nice and uniform. From here, I'm ready to finish the coil. I've cut about 8 inches of 28 gauge round, and I'm just going to feed it through, keeping it nice and tight, filling in the gaps of our coil. This finished coil has a really cool texture. It looks like it would be fairly bulky, but wrapping it around the half round ensures that it actually sits fairly flat in the piece, and that most of its bulk is an illusion. For our last coil, I have about 4 inches of 16 gauge half round, one piece of 26 gauge round that's about 6 inches, and one piece of 26 gauge round that's about 12 inches. Then I have 2.5 feet of 30 gauge round. To start this coil, I'm going to wrap the entire length of the 30 gauge round around our 12-inch piece of 26 gauge round. Now it's actually incredibly important to the structure of this coil which direction you choose to coil around. So if you're more comfortable wrapping clockwise around the wire, I would encourage you to do this part counterclockwise. I like to do it or think of it like this. Generally, I would have my 30 gauge over the top of my 26 gauge and turn away from me. Because that's the way that I would normally do it, I want to do it the opposite direction to make the next step in the structure a little bit easier on me. So I'll have the 30 gauge underneath and be turning towards me. Once I've coiled all of the 30 gauge around my 26, I actually want to go back and twist it to loosen it just a touch from that core wire. I need to be able to slip this whole coil off of our 26 gauge. Once it's loose, I can just pinch it at one end and pull my 26 gauge out of our 30 gauge coil. From this point I can take that 12-inch piece of 26 and actually cut it in half. I'll now have 3 pieces of 26 gauge round going into the center of the core. The next step is to take that 30 gauge that we had coiled around the 26 and stretch it, pinching carefully at both ends and pulling evenly to make sure that it has the same amount of stretch across the total length. That'll do. Our stretched out 30 gauge should look something like this. This little wavy pattern will help us establish the look of our next coil. I'm going to prepare my 3 26 gauge round cores the same way that we did for the King's coil. Taking a little bit of masking tape and just flattening them together in a nice parallel line. Once I have our core all paired together, I can begin the coil. To secure the end, I'm going to take the end of our 30 gauge and wrap it around one of the two outside 26s once or twice, just to secure it into place so that it's ready for us to build the main coil. This is where it becomes important that we wrapped our coil opposite direction that we would usually coil. Getting this to wrap around all three of our 26s while they lay flat next to each other is pretty tedious and a little bit frustrating, and it's only made more difficult if you have to do it the opposite direction from how you would usually coil. The waviness of the wire is what establishes the pattern of this coil. Let's go ahead and get it started, and then I will show you a close-up of what this one will look like. I'm going to go ahead and clamp all three of the endings of our 26, making sure that everything is sitting flush next to each other, and just carefully and slowly, with putting little tension onto our 30 gauge. Let it wrap around all three of the 26s. If you pull too tight, it'll cause them to go out of alignment and to bunch, just like with the King's coil. And we don't want that to happen. Now that we've got a fair amount, I'll go ahead and pause here and let you take a close-up look. This kinked wire makes a really cool wavy pattern in the alien coil. From here, I'm just going to go ahead and repeat the same process, slowly coiling around our 26s and just making sure not to put too much pressure, or that will cause them to bunch up out of alignment. It becomes much more obvious when things fall out of place in this coil than it does in the King's coil. So just take your time, go slowly, and make sure that everything sits nice and flush. As I'm coiling, I put almost no tension on the fingers guiding the 30 gauge. They're purely there just to make sure that the wires go in the correct space, and I'm not putting any tension onto the 26s. I don't want them to fall out of alignment as I'm coiling. Once you've coiled the full amount of the 30 gauge, you can go back and untwist the 26s a little bit. As long as they haven't crossed over the top of each other and they're still sitting parallel, this twisting isn't really that big of a deal as you're coiling. Just make sure that they're sitting flat inside the structure. The finished coil should look something like this. From here we can connect the structure to the core. Again, I like to use something a little bit sturdier, so I'm using 16 gauge half round. I'm going to go ahead and wrap my 26s around twice and flatten that into place. From here I can begin to coil this wrapped structure around it. Once I've got it all the way around, just going to flatten it all in with my nylon tips. Secure the endings and snip the excess. From here I'm going to go ahead and take a piece of 28 gauge round and just fill in and finish off the coil. Here's a close-up view of what that alien coil looks like finished. It's quite a tedious process to build this coil, but I think that the finished product is worth it. It looks really cool. And here we have all three finished coils. Our variation on the double coil, the king's coil, and the alien coil. If you liked this video or found it helpful, go ahead and like the video below and subscribe to my channel for more content similar in the future. For more of my work, check out my Instagram page or my website. The link to those is in the description of this video. And as always, a special thank you goes out to those who are already supporting this channel through Patreon. I do offer exclusive content for my patron supporters, things like start-to-finish tutorials for some of my designs, as well as access to polls to decide what kind of content we should cover in each week's video. If you're interested in helping support the channel, check out the link below in the description of this video.